It starts like any other morning. You're scrolling your feed, sipping your coffee, thinking about your day, and then, boom, not a market crash, not a recession alert. A flash across the screen. Tactical nuclear weapon detonated in eastern Ukraine. Suddenly stocks plummet. Oil surges, the dollar swings. Gold explodes. Flights are grounded, panic spreads. You feel it in your gut, because in that one headline lies every investor's worst nightmare. Not just war, but the unimaginable, nuclear war. Is this sensationalism? Or is it a credible scenario in today's tangled web of geopolitics, proxy wars, and market uncertainty? Today, we're answering the question that nobody wants to face, but every smart investor, economist, and citizen must understand. Will there be a nuclear war in Ukraine? And what would that mean for your financial future? Let's cut through the noise, decode the real risks, and confront the threat behind the headlines. Chapter 1. The Anatomy of a Threat. When Vladimir Putin said he would use all available means to protect Russia's claims in Ukraine, the world froze. And when he added, "I'm not bluffing," well, that sent chills through every government, every trading floor, every war room on the planet. But here's the strange thing. When someone has to say they're not bluffing, they usually are. Military analysts from Washington to Berlin quickly poured cold water on the likelihood of actual nuclear deployment. Not because they trust Putin, but because the strategic value just isn't there. Tactical nuclear weapons, the kind Russia might use in Ukraine, are nothing like Cold War-era intercontinental bombs. These are low-yield battlefield weapons, 5 to 20 kilotons in explosive power. Devastating, absolutely, but not game-changing. Using one wouldn't end the war. It might not even tip the scales, and worst of all for Moscow, it would alienate the very countries Russia needs to survive. China, India, Iran, and Brazil. Partners who have publicly condemned nuclear use under any circumstance. So why keep rattling the saber? Because the threat itself has power. Putin knows that markets react. NATO hesitates. Diplomats panic. Investors flee risk. And that, in a proxy war like Ukraine, is a weapon all by itself. Chapter 2. Why it hasn't happened yet. We're more than 2 years into the full-scale invasion. Hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Cities flattened, economies strained, sanctions everywhere. And yet, despite mounting pressure, nuclear weapons haven't left storage. Not once. Even in October 2022, when Ukrainian troops pushed back in Kharkiv and Kherson, and the CIA estimated a 50% chance of nuclear use, Russia held back. Even when Russian generals privately discussed it, even when they repositioned tactical weapons to make deployment easier, Putin never gave the order. Why? Because the consequences would be catastrophic. For Ukraine, yes, but also for Russia. A single nuclear detonation would break an 80-year-old global taboo, invite direct retaliation, perhaps not nuclear, but devastating nonetheless. Trigger crushing diplomatic and economic isolation, even from allies. Shatter any chance of international legitimacy for years to come. And then there's the unpredictable factor: fallout. Tactical nukes can't be neatly contained. Wind, weather, terrain, all variables that could spread radioactive material into Russian territory onto Russian troops. What would be the gain? A few square miles of battlefield advantage? A psychological blow that might actually strengthen Ukraine's resolve? Even from a cold Machiavellian lens, it doesn't make sense. That's why, even at his angriest, even at his most isolated, Putin has kept the red button under glass. Chapter 3. But what if he's pushed too far? While logic and deterrence have held so far, the risk hasn't vanished. It's evolved. In November 2024, Putin signed a new nuclear doctrine. It quietly shifted the rules. Under the revised policy, Russia could use nuclear weapons even in response to non-nuclear attacks, as long as those attacks came from a state supported by a nuclear power. That's a game changer. It means if Ukraine, using US-supplied weapons like ATACMS missiles, strikes Russian military targets inside Russia, Russia could interpret that as grounds for nuclear response. Not necessarily a massive launch, but a small surgical detonation designed to shock and awe. And that's what terrifies Western analysts. Because for all the restraint we've seen, the new doctrine lowers the threshold. It makes the scenario plausible, not likely, but plausible, under specific extreme conditions. And when you combine that with Putin's growing sense of siege, his age, his legacy obsession, and increasing battlefield frustration, the danger becomes harder to ignore. It's no longer about whether nuclear war is smart. It's about whether it might seem like the least bad option to a man with his back against the wall. Chapter 4. The Investor's Nightmare Scenario. So, let's assume for a moment that the unthinkable happens. A tactical nuke is detonated somewhere in Donetsk or Kherson. What happens next? The markets react instantly, not over hours, in seconds. Algorithms trigger mass sell-offs, safe haven assets erupt, oil climbs past $150 a barrel, gold hits new records, treasury yields collapse, the VIX, the fear index, goes vertical. But this isn't just a temporary blip. The global economic landscape reshapes overnight. Shipping in the Black Sea halts. Russian oil becomes untouchable. Supply chains in Eastern Europe disintegrate. Energy prices choke global industry. Inflation surges back with a vengeance. Central banks freeze, paralyzed between rates and recession. In the US, defense stocks rally. Lockheed Martin and Raytheon see record demand. Cybersecurity firms skyrocket. But consumer sectors collapse. Tourism, retail, tech, all tank. Emerging markets crumble, especially in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. The euro falls, the ruble vanishes. Global GDP projections are revised down. Again. And in all of this, everyday investors, retirees, business owners, side hustlers feel the squeeze. Not because they invested in Ukraine, but because war, especially nuclear war, rewrites the global rulebook. Chapter 5. Bluff Brinkmanship and the market's memory. Strangely, one of the biggest reasons we haven't seen nuclear use yet is credibility. Putin has cried nuclear wolf too many times. Each threat, each veiled warning has slowly eroded his leverage. In the early days, when he warned NATO against helping Ukraine, it worked, briefly. But as time passed and the West called his bluff, the threats lost bite. Traders noticed. Governments noticed. Even China noticed. That's why, despite his growing desperation, Putin has kept the threats vague, implied, deniable. Because if he bluffs again and backs down, he loses credibility and coercive power. But if he follows through even once, he loses global legitimacy forever. It's a high-wire act, and one slip could plunge the world into chaos. Chapter 6. Miscalculation. The silent threat. When we think of nuclear war, we imagine deliberate choices. Leaders in war rooms, buttons pressed after hours of high-level meetings. But history warns us. It's not always the calculated decisions that cause the biggest disasters, it's the mistakes. The most terrifying threat we face today isn't necessarily a cold-blooded decision from the Kremlin to launch a tactical nuke. It's an error, a chain of misunderstandings, faulty intelligence, or one local commander making the wrong call under pressure. Consider this. Ukraine launches a coordinated drone and missile attack on Russian military installations, possibly as a last-ditch attempt to break a stalemate. A few missiles miss their mark and hit civilian areas in Belgorod or Rostov. The Russian media machine kicks in. Outrage spreads like wildfire. Kremlin hardliners demand blood. In the fog of war, where tensions are sky-high and communication channels are strained, a mid-level commander operating under vague doctrine and unclear rules of engagement authorizes a nuclear strike, believing it to be a justified response. This isn't just a dark fantasy. US and NATO forces conduct simulations for exactly these types of scenarios, because they're plausible. Especially now when Russia's nuclear command and control structures have been partially decentralized. As battlefield weapons get smaller and easier to move, the risk of one going off by mistake increases. Russia's doctrine has already evolved. The lines between conventional and nuclear capabilities are blurrier than ever. And in a fast-moving conflict zone, where decisions happen in minutes, not hours, one glitch in communication, one misinterpretation, could trigger irreversible consequences. And the scariest part for investors, you can't price this kind of uncertainty. Markets can adapt to inflation, interest rates, or even war. But a nuclear accident? That's unquantifiable. It's not a recession. It's an event horizon. Everything changes, from market sentiment to commodity flows to central bank strategy. The threat of miscalculation is like a silent fuse. You don't hear it ticking. But when it goes off, the detonation isn't just military, it's financial, psychological, and global. That's why it's the most chilling variable in this entire equation. Chapter 7. What smart investors do right now. In a world where nuclear weapons are part of the conversation again, the question for investors isn't whether to panic, but how to prepare. The first step is recognizing that geopolitical risk is no longer some rare, abstract concern. It's now as central to investment strategy as earnings reports, inflation data, and central bank decisions. And when the possibility of nuclear escalation, however slim, enters the picture, risk models need to evolve. So what are smart investors doing right now? They're reallocating, not retreating. We're seeing increased exposure to defense stocks, companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. These firms often surge during geopolitical crises, especially when governments ramp up military budgets in anticipation of prolonged conflict. In fact, defense is becoming a hedge of its own. At the same time, precious metals, especially gold, are back in the spotlight. Not just as an inflation hedge, but as a geopolitical shelter. If a single nuke detonates, even on a battlefield, gold will soar as currencies and equity markets spiral. Energy diversification is also key. Europe's dependence on Russian gas has taught investors a harsh lesson. Now, portfolios with exposure to U.S. natural gas, LNG infrastructure, and non-Russian oil producers are better positioned to weather volatility. And let's not forget non-correlated assets like commodities and agricultural ETFs. In conflict zones, food and fuel become the first dominoes to fall. Smart capital is flowing into assets that move independently from global equities. But beyond asset allocation, there's a deeper level of intelligence at play. The best investors aren't reacting to headlines, they're interpreting context. Watching not just what happens, but why it happens. Missile tests, troop movements, diplomatic signals. These are now as important as quarterly earnings or GDP forecasts. And most importantly, they're not overreacting to noise. Because not every threat becomes a crisis, but every threat does reveal something about how the market perceives fear. The truth is, the possibility of nuclear use in Ukraine, however unlikely, does change the game. It shifts the psychological floor of global markets, and that's something every investor, big or small, needs to take seriously. Preparedness is no longer optional. It's the price of staying in the game. We're living through history. Messy, terrifying, unpredictable history. The kind they'll write books about in 50 years. And while a nuclear war in Ukraine still sits in the realm of extreme risk, it's not a fantasy anymore. It's a scenario, a pathway, a possibility that deserves your attention, not your panic. Because in today's markets, survival belongs to those who read the future, not those who react to the present. If this helped you think clearer, smarter, and with more control over your financial outlook, show some love. Hit the like button. Subscribe to stay sharp on the stories that actually move markets, and turn on the bell icon so you never miss what matters most.